Hello, good morning everyone. Welcome again to my YouTube channel. My name is David. I'm happy to be here again. And this week's proposal it's on slow looking and experimental learning. I would like to thank my colleague Dr. Servet Alten for opening my eyes and guiding me through this very interesting reading of a book written by Sherry Tishman, which is part of the Harvard Project Zero. So let's have a look at this slow looking idea, and then I have added to it the experimental learning and see how this type of learning can fit into the perspective of slow looking. The idea is to practice the learning through careful observation. So before we start, this is the book that I'm talking about, written by Sherry Tishman, again from Harvard Project Zero. And I have another session on Harvard Project Zero, in particular about visible thinking routines, which you can find also in my channel. So the author says in the book that how the patient immersive attention to content can produce active cognitive opportunities for meaning making and critical thinking that may not be possible through high-speed means of information delivery. And then why I think this is important when we talk about patient immersive attention, when we talk about critical thinking skills, when we're talking about making the learning meaningful for the students. What we need to understand first is who do we have in our classrooms? And what we have is what we call members of the Generation Z. Students that rarely slow down, rarely look around them, and then basically what I think they need to do is, based on what Dr. Servet Alten says, that slow looking happens everywhere and can often appear as a passive state from the outside. And this is what probably we need to do for our students. If we look at the characteristics of the Generation Z, what strikes me the most is the fact that we have students that in theory have 8 seconds of attention span. Less focused students, but very tech savvy, digital natives, multitaskers, interactive. But probably this aspect of being less focused based on the generation they belong to is the one that we should work on, the one that we should probably develop further and see how can we change those habits. My proposal then to change that aspect of being less focused is this idea of slow looking. So based on the block that you have the source underneath the sentence, slow looking means simply taking the time to observe carefully, and making sure that the amount of time given to the students to do an activity is generous. And then we give them the time to think carefully, to observe, to be attentive. And that makes me also think of one of the proposals that I had in my last session when I was proposing some mindfulness activities. One of them was the mindfulness eating. So paying attention to what we're doing, to the taste, to how does it look like, trying to bring more depth into the analysis of things. And this should be a common practice in everyday life. This is something that we should do on a daily basis, to carefully examine an object. So this idea of slow looking comes from museums basically, and the need to go to museums and sit and observe and pay attention to little details, because through details is when meaning comes, is when understanding comes. So examine the object that we're looking to analyze, being in sciences, obviously, but also being in Lang and Leet, if we're analyzing a poem, if you're analyzing a source in history, if you're doing a field work in geography, if we're doing any activity in mathematics, pay attention to the detail to make sure that we become and we are successful. So again, this Slow looking is based on observation. As I said before, is a practice that comes from museums. Museums that can be seen as educational tools, as places to go and learn, and being patient, and have this immersive attention to the content of the paintings, and trying to understand, to bring meaning into what we're learning, and through the meaning to develop the critical thinking skills that we can have, and we will never have if we go too quick, as the Generation Z members have, this attention span, this high speed daily life that they have, this constant information delivery that leads to certain superficiality in the analysis, in the objectivity. An example can be when we look at the news. News come one after the other. In a minute or in 30 seconds, an information is given and we move on, without having the time to analyze, to bring a deeper perspective of what we've been told. So the importance of slow looking is basically taking the time to do things and to avoid superficiality. I think this is extremely important for the students. And one of the proposals that I can bring, one way of putting this slow looking into practice, is through what we call experimental learning. Something that is obvious, something that happens on a yearly basis in every school, but sometimes it does not happen explicitly. We implement experimental learning in class, in particular in sciences, if you have the infrastructure to do so, but it's important to put it in place across the subjects through this principle of slow looking. So why is important this experimental learning? The first one is because it gives more importance to providing the environment and the resources to learn by experimenting, by touching, by observing, by witnessing. We need the environment, the space, we need the resources, not only in terms of material, but in particular in terms of time. And I think time is one of the crucial elements that is missing from schools. Time to collaborate, to plan, to deliver, to standardize assessment, to verticalize the curriculum, to create interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary activities, but also to bring this slow looking into classrooms. Of course, this experimental learning is a more hands-on approach to the learning process, is the way to back up opinions with facts, with evidence. This experimental learning is also important because it makes the learning an experience that moves beyond the classroom. What do we mean by moving the learning beyond the classroom? We mean bringing real life situations into classroom. We mean contextualizing the learning by, for example, putting in place performance-based tasks. And if you don't know, or if you're not familiar with what performance-based tasks are, I invite you to go to my channel and have a look at the session which is specific about it. And in particular, the proposal is to work on GRASP's activities. But contextualizing the learning and bringing the real world, the real life into the classrooms. And that brings meaning to the students. And the best way of doing it is through experimental learning. Basically, this type of learning also helps to acquire and develop certain skills, the knowledge, and of course the understanding. Because through the understanding, through the meaning, is when the knowledge comes, and when that helps us to develop certain skills. Why? Because we do it through experiences and not through formal education or formal training. It's not by mastering a class, it's by witnessing an evidence that backs up the theory that is being delivered in class. These slow learning experiences, this experimental learning, can be based on Kolb's experiential learning cycle. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but I really invite you to have a look at these Kolb's theories, which are like a cycle, like a design cycle, yeah, that can look at the reflective observation of an experience. So after being engaged in a specific experience, we reflect, we observe calmly about it, and this observation will help us to reflect. And then we will bring an abstract conceptualization in it, and this will help us to gain knowledge or to develop skills from that observation of that concrete experience. And then we can experiment with it, trying it out, testing new skills, trying new things, being a risk taker, not being afraid of mistakes, and then go back to the concrete experience. So this idea of the Kolb's experiential learning cycle fits perfectly well, from my perspective, into the slow looking and into the experimental learning. Again, through the experience, through reflecting on the experience, through conceptualizing that experience, and experiment with it actively, trying new things, bringing new things into the learning process. Basically, this Kolb's model, as we said, is divided into 4 different steps. The first one is when the student has a concrete experience with the content that is being taught. That experience has to be tangible and has to be measured and planned by the teacher. And then the student is given the time to reflect on that experience and compare it with prior knowledge or with another experience that happened before that. This reflection on that experience helps the student to develop new ideas because he's been able to compare, to reflect, and to bring a better knowledge of the changes. And then finally, based on those new ideas, the learner will act on those new ideas. And the experimenting will lead to an experiential learning process. I don't know to what extent this was clear to you or not, and I will be happy to bring more examples. So please write on the chat if you have any question or any specific aspect that you would like me to develop further with this Kolb's model. In any case, what kind of examples can we bring of experimental learning that can be also used to implement the Kolb's model? If you teach arts, what about an atelier method? The atelier method, you know what it is to have an object in the center and then have the students looking carefully at it, learning how to look at the object, how to see, take the time to develop certain skills to be able to look at the detail and then represent the detail. So the experience is the atelier method, is the looking at. That's the experience. And the reflection on the experience will help the students following the Kolb's model to change, to make comparisons, and to produce a better piece of work after that. If you teach sciences, then a simple scientific observation. You do so many in class, don't you? And these scientific observations can be based on the life cycle of a butterfly, seeds, plants. If you teach geography, a field work to observe a landscape, a river, how the river changes downstream, to observe physical transformations of the environment. That's very interesting. Visiting museums or field trips if you teach history, going to the trenches if you want to teach World War I, going to specific museums, bringing objects into the classroom, using manipulatives in mathematics. All those are examples of experimental learning, which I'm sure they will make the learning successful. So basically, the advantages of the slow looking, it helps students to navigate complex systems and build connections. Yeah. So the idea of taking something apart, being a physical object or a concept or an idea, looking at that idea in particular, what are the components of that idea, of that concept that can be taught through a poem, through a source, through a video, through a song. The slow cooking also, the slow looking is because actually slow cooking is pretty much the same idea, isn't it? Doing things calmly, carefully to develop the taste. And that's the first thing that came into my mind when I read the slow looking principles. So it fuels empathy and self-awareness because it changes the point. Looking through the naked eye can give us a different perspective using a microscope in sciences, isn't it? And asking the students to really carefully observe and develop and think about that reality. It makes them more empathetic and awareness of many things. It builds up the idea of others and think together. Yeah, you can have the whole class doing that activity, looking carefully in that atelier method, for example. And then you can ask them to share, to repeat what can they see. And that can link into a visible thinking routine. See, think, share. What do you see? What do you think about it? And sharing those perspectives. Is it the same? Is it different? What questions do you come up with when you do this observation? And then the students learn to describe in detail. Imagine the kind of skills that can be developed, literacy skills, writing skills, because oral skills, communication skills, they can describe, they can bring more detail, more attention into what they say. They can even try to describe things that they cannot see, but they can feel or they can guess some hidden message, some hidden ideas behind the object that they're observing. Basically, the more we look, the more we can see in this fast-forward world. So I invite you to put in practice these slow-looking ideas into your classroom and tell me if you enjoyed it. These are the sources that I've used, a book review from my colleague Dr. Servet Alten, and that link to the website of Harvard Project Zero. I hope you found this session useful, and please, again, share with me any experience that you may have with slow-looking or experimental learning. Thank you very much. See you next time.